The door opened quickly and creaked, and the man behind it shouted that he was already there. He was very nervous because it was unsafe to be there now, and he had to leave urgently. His interlocutor did not understand what he was talking about, so he reminded him about Humid Street. The executioner Leakin, the destroyer of vampires, the lord of the blue evil, was heading here with the undead. And now he would certainly not let the Dark Order leave just like that. He was very worried that he would get rid of them in a cruel way. But his interlocutor was not particularly concerned about this. After all, he hoped that the best holy knights were with them. But he still didn't know what had happened to those very knights. All these knights had turned into walking dead and were approaching them, and their young lord commanded this terrible army. They had not finished talking when dozens of enraged zombies appeared outside the windows. They were ready to tear apart anyone who got in their way, and they could not escape from this enraged undead crowd, and begging them for mercy was also completely useless. They did not understand how this could have happened because the zombies were supposed to serve them. Then someone's black boot pressed one of their hands to the ground. They still hoped that God was on their side and would grant them salvation. But no matter how much they begged for salvation, it did not come. And now the only salvation was the man with a gun standing over him, and divine energy began to seep through his skin. This young man was sure that God's blessing would lead to hell. Rumors spread throughout the city about the expulsion of the seventh prince. It was a disgrace to the Holy Emperor. It was incomprehensible how such a person could have been born in the Holy Empire, for he was the unprincipled dregs of humanity. One day the prince began to make advances toward the archbishop's daughter and was caught. He should have simply accepted his punishment as inevitable, but instead, he caused a disturbance in the archbishop's hall. It was then that the Holy Emperor lost his temper and flew into a rage. In his terrible fury, he sent the prince to the land of the dead spirits. The emperor sent him there to reflect on his actions. But the prince only caused a commotion and wanted to send himself to the other world after being rejected by the girl. Fortunately, he did not succeed in doing so and remained alive. But after these events, he became a completely different person. And from then on, he began his new humble life in a monastery. Many in the city were seemingly obsessed with him, but even more people viewed his sudden change with suspicion. Various rumors spread throughout the city. Some said that a demon had entered his body for blasphemy. Others claimed that the prince had made a deal with the devil, and some even saw a dead man wandering around the monastery. Each of them had their own thoughts on the matter. The boy asked the zombies this question, but they only mumbled something incomprehensible. It was young Alan Elfolds, and he was only 16 years old. He was the famous seventh prince who had the necromancer class. A system window appeared next to him all the time. He was sure that the zombies were the reason for the rumors spreading. If this continued, he could be mistakenly labeled a heretic, and then he didn't know what to do. He was not Alan Elfolds, but an ordinary Korean boy who had ended up in the body of the Holy Emperor's nasty grandson when he tried to kill himself. Unlike others, however, he could see the status windows of zombies. He used his necromancer abilities to become the guardian of the cemetery. In their city, this was unexpectedly perceived as heresy. At first he was confused, but then he began to get used to it, and perhaps it was time to stop. After all, they had worked so well together, with some zombies digging graves. Other zombies acted as skilled grave diggers. They even put up gravestones on the graves together. In general, they had a great time and worked hard together. The zombies were happy about this and even showed positive emotions. But like a bolt from the blue, his words that it was time to part ways came as a shock. The zombies cried, screamed, and were very upset while the guy tried to calm them down. But the zombies didn't want to listen to anything and flew into a wild rage. This guy's first life had been turbulent, but he was trying to live his second life more peacefully. And since he hadn't had time to get close to these zombies yet, he promised to think about it some more. And the zombies happily agreed to his terms. He ordered them not to waste any time and to get to work. On the way to their cemetery, two people were walking from a neighboring village. They were carrying the fresh corpses of villagers on a cart to bury them. They themselves did not want to end up in the place of these poor wretches, so they wanted to get to the prince as quickly as possible and try to find a way to help this cursed village. These were the last bodies of the unfortunate victims of a terrible disease. Everyone had fled from this village, and only the dead bodies remained. They felt very awkward asking, but they wanted to ask the prince to go to the village. The entire village had died out, and the men were sure that they had not yet passed away only because they often visited the prince, bringing him the lifeless bodies. The prince thought that a blasphemous prince did not possess such powers, but the men began to beg him. They sincerely believed that they were completely safe with him. The prince realized that there had been some kind of misunderstanding, but he still agreed and went with them to this eerie village. The drains were no longer working, so they had to be careful. The prince asked them not to hang on him, but they were afraid to let him go, because the amulet had to be kept close to the body. They decided to search another house when suddenly something slipped past them. They were very frightened but thought it might just be a rat. However, the prince decided to go and check it out, even though the men tried to dissuade him because it was dangerous to wander around alone, and they both had a very bad feeling about it. It was as if it was radiating some kind of deadly aura. When the prince approached the house, only a small rat ran out to meet him. Coming closer to the prince, it looked him over and sniffed him. But it was not an ordinary rat at all, but a real monster. In the basement of the house, there were dozens of others like it with glowing red eyes. Maybe there were even hundreds of angry, bloodthirsty rats. At its squeak, the whole pack rushed out of the basement. When the prince saw them, he realized that they were real, evil zombie rats. The last people in the village had probably died because of them. The prince tried to drive them away with his shovel. He struck one of the rats very hard and sent it to the other world, although he himself did not quite understand how this could have happened. But suddenly another rat nearby squeaked and breathed its last. The prince shouted at the angry pack of zombie rats that he hadn't done it on purpose. But they didn't hear him and knocked him to the ground, attacking him ferociously. During the struggle, he didn't notice that his shovel had fallen into the water. While the prince was trying to fight off the rats, it glowed in the depths. Illuminated by its unusual light, the water flowed down the village street. This was the beginning of the use of a new skill, the Swamp of Death. The prince himself knew nothing about it, not even that he possessed such a skill. The puddle of dirty water turned into holy water, and the rats that spread disease were cleansed. This is how the prince learned that he could use other skills besides raising zombies. He even used his necromancer skills for purification. His body was filled with holy power because he was the grandson of the Holy Emperor. Apparently, this was the reason why his skills were sanctified, and this holy blood made him the only holy necromancer. That was why all the zombies in the cemetery were so kind to him. Suddenly, the prince noticed something in the darkness near the neighboring house. Charlotte, a girl who lived next door, came out onto the street thinking that everyone had already gone to the other side. The men waved and called her over, asking where her parents were. They didn't notice the huge knife flashing in Charlotte's hands. Moving with insane speed, she began to strike one blow after another. Her eyes burned with a mad red light, like those rats in the basement, and now the blade of her knife was just a centimeter from the prince's throat. But the prince realized that she had not yet completely turned into a zombie. This was indicated by the fact that she was holding the sharp knife in her hands. She growled something indistinct, but tears were streaming from her eyes. Amidst this growling, the prince could make out that she was calling for her mom and dad. Suddenly, she lunged at him, but he was able to defend himself with the handle of a shovel. When the blade of her knife touched the shovel, everything around them was again illuminated by a bright light. The holy water seemed to burn right through her body. The prince knew that it would hurt her if he struck her now, but he had no other choice, and he couldn't look away. The prince pushed Charlotte very hard and dipped her into the holy water. It took a lot of effort to hold her there, but it worked, and the girl began to heal. People from neighboring villages learned that he had cleansed the rats that had flooded the village and saved Charlotte, so they came to the prince in the hope that he would help them. But the prince slammed his book shut and replied that Charlotte had died. Hearing that she was no longer alive, the people were very upset. The prince did not know how he should save people. The blood of the Holy Emperor flowed in his veins, but he had no abilities. The people did not know what to do now, for they had come a long way in the hope that he could save them. The prince could not understand who had told them that he could save people. But suddenly, a man ran into the church with a loud cry. He joyfully shouted to everyone that Charlotte had woken up. It was all thanks to the prince, and Charlotte looked tired, so they put her to bed. People didn't like that he had deceived them by saying that Charlotte had died. But the prince didn't care about their opinion of him. After all, he still had more divine power than they did. But he realized that he would have to help them, but there were several conditions. He saw everything about them, and now before him was Parlock, 75 years old, with a mastery of gardening, chatter, and tricks, but he was full of doubts. The old man wanted help from the prince, but he himself did not trust him, apparently because he considered him worthless. The prince was not going to work for free, and said to give him money and food, and they all had to completely restore the cathedral. Hearing this, they wanted to object, but the prince reminded them that their lives depended on it. But the prince had one more small condition for them all. The prince wanted the holy knights to know nothing about this deal, because he could get into trouble if the holy family found out. Everyone seemed to agree, and the prince was very happy that the cathedral, which had been intended for exile, would finally be put to good use. He was told that 30 dead bodies had turned into zombies, but that was solvable. He shouted at the people to grab their pitchforks quickly, but these words puzzled them. But the prince explained that they had asked him to deal with the zombies, and surely they didn't expect him to fight alone. Smiling, he suggested that they do the hard work while he read a holy prayer. The people in the crowd began to whisper that he was a real demon. Suddenly, an indistinct, terrifying growl was heard from the street. Looking out the window, they saw with horror that the zombies had come for them. The prince ordered them to quickly grab their weapons and swing them as best they could. And on the street, illuminated by the red sunset, was a huge crowd of zombies. They were all slowly walking toward the cathedral, one after another. There were countless numbers of them, but not 30. The prince asked Parlok how this could have happened, but Parlok just laughed it off, saying it was his fault and that he hadn't seen them while he was running. And then a terrible, fierce battle began between the people and the zombies. The people, armed with improvised weapons, barely managed to withstand the onslaught of the monsters. The prince fought selflessly with only his shovel in his hands. But at the first opportunity, he used his skill, Swamp of Death. However, using this skill was not the most difficult part. He had once been a necromancer in that other world, and to earn a little extra money, he tried his hand at being a beta tester. But unfortunately, he left this world after being struck by an electric shock. He lost consciousness and then woke up in his new body. But fortunately, his skills from the game also moved with him, and divine power changed his body. But it was not so easy to control it. Every time he used this skill, divine power began to pour out. He didn't know if it could be fixed because it affected everyone. One of the men cried and screamed that he couldn't take it anymore. He understood perfectly well that he was surrounded by zombies. But one of these zombies was his beloved wife before all this happened. He couldn't bring himself to destroy this woman. It seemed that something human still remained in her. But to him, as her loving husband, it only seemed that way. The prince managed to save the poor man from certain death in time. The zombie flew away, hitting the ground, but the man continued to feel sorry for her. The prince reminded him that his wife had not been human for a long time. Her body had long since begun to rot, and her soul had long since been lost. If he wanted his wife to suffer, then he had to run away. If he didn't want that, then he had to stop crying and destroy the zombies. There were countless numbers of them around them. They were everywhere, but suddenly the prince noticed something unusual. The sky above him lit up with some kind of unusual bright light, and like a bolt from the blue, a blonde girl descended to the ground. She was so strong that she jumped to the ground, leaving a deep dent around her. She stood up and asked the prince if he was all right. Autumn and winter had always been times of widespread disease. She thought that was in the past, and that next year they would be fine. The girl sincerely believed the words of her beloved mother. Once running into the house, she screamed that the streets were full of rats with red eyes. What she saw in the house shook her to the core. Her father had already become a zombie, and her mother's fate was sealed. While she was still alive, she shouted at Charlotte to run, but Charlotte was paralyzed with fear and couldn't move. She just stood there and watched as her loved ones turned into monsters. After the stress she went through, she remembered almost nothing. Street rats and her own parents chased her down the street. She tried to defend herself with whatever she could get her hands on. No matter how scared she was, she managed to protect herself. But suddenly, all the people in the village seemed strange to her, and the rats that had been trying to eat her stopped paying attention to her. She realized that she was becoming one of them and that now there was no saving her. But she still continued to hope for some kind of miracle, as any human would. And only one person was able to save her in time. She remembered his words that there was no other way out, and how she briefly sank into the depths of the holy water. Then she woke up in a place she didn't recognize. When she came to, she couldn't understand who he was, or where these memories came from. Charlotte was told that it was the prince who had asked for her to be taken care of. There were still zombies outside, so she had to sit quietly. Then she saw the prince shouting at a man to stop whining and start killing zombies. She saw that one of the zombies was about to attack the prince from behind and was very frightened for him. It dawned on her that the prince needed someone to help him. Without hesitation, she jumped out the window to rush to his aid. At that moment, the zombies were already reaching their rotten hands toward the prince. But she made it just in time and was able to help him. This girl was so strong that the prince couldn't believe his eyes. She was able to handle a whole bunch of zombies on her own. The people rejoiced with joy and were ready to carry her on their hands. The prince guessed that this purification before turning into a zombie had somehow affected her. He didn't even know what abilities he had, and he asked the villagers to deal with the remains of their relatives. He understood that people were very tired, but it was better for everyone. The dead had suffered, and the people freed them from their intense pain. The prince promised to help them all with the necessary ritual. The ritual itself was quite simple. They had to bury the dead and wish them peace. This was so that their spirits would not wander among the living and could rest in peace. In fact, that was why the prince had been banished here. In the lands of the spirits, there was a high chance of zombies appearing, and someone had to deal with all the dead. It was all quite strange, because he had never heard of so many villages being destroyed at once. And it was still too early for the wave of death to begin. The prince summoned the village elder to talk. He asked if the elder had noticed anything strange in the village, but everything was calm. The infection began to spread about a month ago, so it was quite possible that it was planned. Hearing this, the residents thought he was talking about a necromancer, but the prince meant something completely different by his words. He did not want his assumptions to cause such disgust. But if his theory was correct, then the one who controlled the zombies must have been nearby. And all that remained was to find him. Saying goodbye to everyone, he went to sleep, telling the villagers to take care of the rest. But now he was not a prince, but a simple worker. The funeral had been very difficult, and he urgently needed to rest. But even so, the prince's short sleep was interrupted by wild cries from the street. Half asleep, he couldn't understand what the cries were about and who had stolen what. But suddenly he understood what was going on. It turned out that zombies had stolen a person. People claimed to have seen it with their own eyes. The zombies took advantage of the situation because people were tired after a sleepless night. But suddenly they saw Moriana being carried away by a zombie over his shoulder. Moriana was a young lady who gathered herbs and lived in this village. She used to help the villagers a lot and assist the wounded, but the prince didn't seem to know her. The villagers claimed that she was beautiful and had once rejected the prince. Now the prince remembered what situation they were talking about. People reminded him that such an insult had almost driven him to his death. The villagers wanted to form a search party and go looking for Moriana, but the prince thought that first they needed to check everything. After all, it was the first time he had seen zombies steal a person, and he needed to find out what was going on. Sir Gantz, a hunter from the village, might be able to help them track them down, and they decided to embark on this very risky expedition. The prince asked someone to tell Gantz to come to him immediately. Suddenly, the prince saw Charlotte standing quietly nearby. They looked at each other silently, and an awkward pause ensued. The prince decided that Charlotte was holding a grudge against him for something. They needed to find the girl as soon as possible before she became zombie dinner. Charlotte also remained standing and silently watched them leave. The zombies moved by dragging their feet along the ground, so they were easy to track, and the men were sure that they had gone there. This cool place was ideal for a zombie hideout. The prince thanked Gantz for his excellent work because he had really done a great job tracking them down. The cave was filled with sinister demonic energy, and it was quite possible that this place was teeming with zombies, or was the very source of the infection. Judging by the behavior of the zombies, it was likely that someone was behind them. At first, the prince suggested burning the place to the ground, forgetting that Morian was inside. It was very dark here, and in such places, the undead's buffs are much stronger. If everyone ran inside for the sake of one woman, they would all die. They needed to prepare better and return to the ship, but of course, that would lower Morian's chances of survival. Suddenly, the prince felt someone's presence behind him. Turning around, he saw a huge mouth and burning red eyes. It was a huge bear that had managed to grab the prince with its teeth. Its huge, sharp fangs pierced the prince's arm like a blade. Everyone ran away in horror, while the bear dragged the prince into its lair. But this bear had actually been dead for a long time. As the prince flew into a huge pit, he managed to use his skill. He then began to use his Swamp of Doom skill again. At the same time, he decided to use another skill. Holding his injured arm, he used the Terrifying Spell skill. As expected, this healing was ineffective because his divine power was almost zero, and in such moments, it is best to switch to skills. But this skill had no effect on the zombie bear. Before the prince stood the king of gluttony, whose main skills were biting, cutting, and gnawing on organs, and his condition was enhanced by necromancy. And since he was enhanced by necromancy, it became clear why he was still holding on even after the holy water. If such a huge beast was controlled by a necromancer, it was problematic, and most importantly, it was necessary to understand how to deal with it with bare hands. But the prince did not give up and fought desperately with his shovel. Suddenly, out of nowhere, Charlotte landed on the bear's head and stabbed her sharp knife right into the monster's eye. But even such a blow was not enough to defeat the zombie bear. The bear rose on its hind legs and began to roar frantically. When he saw Charlotte, the prince did not expect her to follow him. But now it did not matter. The prince shouted at her to hold the bear off as long as she could. This time she did not have enough strength, and the bear threw her to the ground. The bear was ready to sink its terrible fangs into her, but she beat him to it, plunging her knife right into his mouth. Suddenly, a divine light appeared on the zombie bear's body. He fell backward and couldn't get back up quickly. The prince thanked Charlotte for buying him some time to regain his skills. Suddenly, Charlotte saw a rotting hand reaching out to her. Seeing this, Charlotte was completely astonished. The undead had almost crawled out of the ground, and something had to be done urgently. But Charlotte still couldn't believe what was happening. Only the prince smiled contentedly, finding advantage in the situation. With so many zombies, the bear didn't stand a chance. The zombies pounced on the bear and began biting it from all sides. Each of them tried to sink their teeth into the victim's body. But the zombie bear was not going to give up so easily and swatted them all away with its huge paw. But more and more undead creatures were crawling out of the ground like worms. Dozens of rotten hands reached out to the bear, trying to tear off at least a piece of it. The prince explained that this bear had killed many people, which is why it was able to summon so many zombies. But this bear's vitality was definitely much higher than that of many zombies. Even it couldn't cope with so many opponents. And the zombie bear finally fell to the ground, almost breathing its last. Seeing her knife, Charlotte wanted to pull it out of the bear's body. The prince understood that the outcome of this battle was already predetermined. Suddenly, Charlotte saw that the prince was not feeling well. He explained his condition by saying that he had used too much divine power. The zombie bear was defeated, but the prince still did not understand what Charlotte was doing there and why she had followed him. He explained to Charlotte that she had now seen his full power. To Charlotte, it seemed that the prince wanted to live quietly, so he asked her to keep everything she had seen a secret. But in reality, he was severely exhausted and asked her to leave him alone. However, to her, he was her savior, and she was ready to fulfill his every wish. Suddenly, the villagers appeared above and called out to them. They asked why Charlotte had jumped down there, and if the prince was all right, and they had brought equipment with them to explore the cave. The prince replied that everything was fine and asked them to go back upstairs, knowing that they would not be able to help anyway. But when they saw the torn body of the zombie bear, they asked who had killed it. This bear was known as the King of Gluttony, but no one knew how many people had already suffered at its hands. The prince also shared his thoughts that there might be a necromancer in the cave. This necromancer tried to turn the cave into his lair and killed the bear. And when the prince and Charlotte arrived, the bear was already dead. The villagers began to gossip that necromancers sounded very scary, but all of the prince's assumptions were very logical. However, they were all still very simple-minded, and Morian was probably already dead. The necromancer tried to lure them in so that he could kill as many people as possible along with the bear. The people did not know what to do next, and the prince suggested moving forward. The prince was quite confident in his bold decision. He had to see with his own eyes how good this necromancer was. It seemed that they had nothing to fear here, but the three of them cautiously moved further into the cold cave. Suddenly, one of them noticed something ahead and called out to the prince. The unfortunate Morian was sitting on the floor with her hands tied behind her back. One of the villagers rushed to her to rescue her. Seeing that she was alive, the prince realized that the necromancer had used her as bait to make it easier to kill him and take control. But looking closely, the prince realized who Morian really was. Raising herself slightly off the ground, Morian called to him quietly. With a sweet smile and eyes full of tears, she asked if the prince had come to save her. But in response, he silently struck her hard on the head with his shovel. Blood spurted from Morian's mouth from the blow. The others present were in complete shock at what they had seen. Morian fell to the ground, and everyone else stood silently, not knowing what to do next. Only the prince thought that he should have hit her with the sharp part of the shovel. Then one of the men became indignant and began to ask the prince what was going on and why he had done such a thing. But the prince had seen everything, and the woman's real name was Morgana. She was 63 years old. Her skills included honey traps, necromancy, curses, and destruction, and seeing all this information, he finally understood that she was not a decoy. The woman tried to justify herself to the prince, but he was not going to listen to her, and told the others to be careful and not let themselves be deceived. After all, in the prince's opinion, she was the necromancer. She had given people her false name and false age. Morian screamed and tried to convince everyone that the necromancer had dragged her here and tortured her. But the prince was not going to believe her and was not taken in by her pretty face. And if she was really telling the truth, he offered her some holy water to drink. If she was a necromancer, her organs would melt. But for ordinary people, it was the best medicine, and all her wounds would heal. She tried to joke that he shouldn't give her such valuable things. But the prince insisted that she drink at least a sip of holy water. The woman didn't understand how he managed to expose her, because she had the perfect disguise. No one suspected anything while she was playing the role of Morian in the village. She couldn't understand how the prince had been able to see through her so easily. One could only guess at the power he possessed, since he had been able to defeat a bear. The prince decided to ask Morgana once more if she was going to drink the holy water. After all, the prince himself had given her the water, but she hadn't lifted a finger. Morgana was going to get rid of him during the wave of destruction. An unknown force knocked the bottle of holy water out of the prince's hands. Skeletons began to crawl out of the ground, and now the prince only hastened his own demise. Morgana had been trying to prolong his life with her actions. But now the prince would have to perish in this cold lair. But the prince was not going to give up so easily and began to beat the skeletons with his shovel. He did not allow the evil spirits to treat him with such arrogance and sent them away while he was still kind. But suddenly a shadow with red eyes flashed behind Morgana. Charlotte jumped on her back and knocked her off her feet with a knife in her hands. The prince stood with his hand on the skeleton's head and thanked Charlotte for her excellent work. Morgana began to ask indignantly what he had done with her skeletons, realizing that the shovel was the source of his energy. But it was not just a shovel, but rather a sacred relic. Now, however, Morgana had better think about herself rather than his shovel. With her life hanging by a thread, she confessed that her name was indeed Morgana, that she was a 63-year-old necromancer, and that she had been captured again. But Morgana had to go further with her sincere confessions. To stay alive, she promised to reveal who had ordered her to get rid of the prince. She had been ordered to lure the prince and disguise his death as a voluntary departure from life. Thus it appeared that the prince had been forced to kill himself. It turned out that the prince was not so pitiful, and Morgana could not understand why he was so indifferent. She received the order to destroy the 7th grandson of the Holy Emperor from the Dark Church. With the help of the bear, she realized that the prince was also a necromancer, and if the church found out about it, they would not let him go so easily. It turned out that Morgana had seen the prince, and now she had to be eliminated. But she begged for mercy, promising in return to keep everything about the prince a secret and reveal everything she knew about the Dark Church. But since she could blab so easily, it was not worth giving in to her pleas, and the prince decided to entrust the fate of Morgana to the villagers. Among them were many people who had lost family members because of her, and she had to pay in full for all her sins. The villagers decided that she should receive as much evil as she had done. They decided to torture her until her last breath and then leave her in the forest. Then her body would be devoured by animals. Her remains would become undead, which was a fitting end for a necromancer who had mocked the dead. After hearing all this, the prince thought that it was to be expected from the villagers. And of course, now the prince's mind was occupied with completely different thoughts. The prince began to ponder the existence of the Dark Church and its activities. Much about this church was described in various ancient books. Of course, he would not be able to find out everything, but he managed to steal a couple of such books, and now they were stored in his inventory. The prince wanted to learn how to talk to spirits, but he thought that it was unlikely that he could acquire such a skill from these books. And so he began to study these books carefully, page by page. Morgana also mentioned in her speech an event known as the Wave of Death. He needed to read more about it and about the killing. The prince tried to understand whether his brothers were behind all this. Since he was a prince, perhaps they were trying to get rid of a rival to the throne, and it was quite possible that this was a real struggle for power. It was all very confusing, but such was the reality of being a member of the royal family. He thought about how they could really destroy him, so he needed to improve his skills as soon as possible. Charlotte quietly observed all these thoughts of the prince. After all, everyone had been saying for a long time that the prince had changed a lot. He wasn't particularly big, but he was always the first to jump into battle. He single-handedly managed to save the lives of many residents of this village, and while Charlotte was coming to her senses, he took care of her parents' bodies. All these thoughts and reflections brought tears to Charlotte's eyes. She wanted to thank him for saving her and her parents, but that wasn't enough. Danger surrounded him, so he needed protection. Charlotte took out a guide to the imperial art of sword fighting. After all, in order to protect the prince, she needed to become stronger. One of the books stated that the undead evolve over time. When the bodies of the dead decompose, they turn into skeletons. But if they manage to preserve their bodies, they become stronger versions of ghouls. In turn, such a ghoul then turns into a doulahan, from a doula to a lord, and then it reincarnates into a bloodthirsty vampire. The further they develop, the smarter and stronger they become. When zombies are in the dark, the mana accumulated in the darkness triggers the development process, which is why these creatures strive for strong mana. The place where all zombies were summoned was called the Land of Dead Spirits. To prevent their flesh from decaying in warm weather, they went to dark and cold corners. When the cold season arrives, the desire to find the land of dead spirits reaches its peak. This time is called the Wave of Death. December 25th is the coldest day of the Wave of Death, the day when Aemon, the king of the dead, died. This is the day when all the undead Go to the land of the dead spirits to regain their lives, and there is about a month left before the wave of death. The witch Morgana planned to kill the prince with the help of zombies. At that moment, Charlotte approached the prince and said she would help him if he let her do it. And he handed her the book he had been reading so intently. He didn't even ask her, but she continued to come to the church every day. She not only sorted through books, but also cleaned up, looked after the cemetery, and prepared food. But the prince thought that sooner or later she would leave anyway. As far as he knew, Grill had adopted her. So now she had a home to which she could always return. Grill looked very scruffy, but he was a good guy. Suddenly, there was a clang at the church door. The doors opened and knights appeared on the threshold. These unexpected guests were the Knights of the Holy Cross. The prince was even frightened by such an unexpected visit. Before him stood Harmon Diane, deputy commander of the Knights of the Holy Cross, who had heard that the prince had captured the witch Morgana. The prince noticed that Diane had decided not to even greet him, apparently because he treated him as an exiled prince. The fact that the Knights of the Holy Cross had already heard the latest news pointed to one detail. It meant that the prince was being secretly watched. The prince said that they had captured her together with the villagers, and the knights had come to verify this. The knight asked again if the prince had really fought alongside the villagers. They also knew that the prince had destroyed the king of beasts with a garden tool, but they also had information that a man named Grill had destroyed the zombies and cornered the witch with holy water. Grill himself told the knights about these epic battles. The prince thought that it had been less than 5 minutes since he had praised this Grill, but the knights still decided that this man had exaggerated the facts a little. But when they saw the traces of the fierce battle themselves, they were convinced that it was true. But the holy knights should not have been so trusting. The knights asked if the prince knew that Morgana belonged to the Dark Church, and he said that he had heard this from her. Harmon Diane confirmed that he knew about this evil organization. It turned out that the witch Morgana had already destroyed 5 villages. The prince deeply regretted not knowing about these incidents earlier. He asked the knights if they had heard that Morgana had been beaten to death and her body thrown away. The knight asked if it was the prince's doing, because to do such a thing would require enormous strength. The prince did not reveal information about his strength, so it was better to stick to Grill's version. And now the prince had to distort the facts of that day a little. He said that while he was there, he almost wet his pants out of fear. The knights who arrived began to turn away at the very thought of it. The knights thought that in such a situation, the prince could hardly know anything about the witch's magic books. They were supposed to take the books on dark magic, but for some reason her bookshelf was empty. The prince suggested that the villagers had burned them because of their sinister aura. Then, unexpectedly for the prince, the knight took out a bag. It was a reward for Morgana in the amount of 80 coins. A handsome reward had been offered for her head, but the prince insisted that he was simply doing his duty. According to the knight, these coins should have been shared with the other inhabitants of the city, but the prince had no intention of doing so. After all, this large reward rightfully belonged to him alone. The knight's work was done, but the prince was no longer listening to them because he was admiring his reward. But suddenly the knight said that now they needed to pack their things. The prince thought that they wanted to expel him again, but a wave of destruction was about to begin, and the knights wanted to accompany them. They continued to care for him because he was a prince. The prince asked where he would be sent after the evacuation, to the imperial palace or to the warm south. But it was planned to send him to a certain estate called Lonia. However, this estate was half a day's journey away, and they would still be in the land of the dead, so what was the point of this evacuation? But the knight explained that the estate was a fortress built to stop the wave of death. They gathered soldiers and prisoners to fight off the zombies. And according to their calculations, unfortunately, there would be many casualties. And they did not want the prince to hold a funeral at the Lonia estate. The prince had no choice but to agree to the evacuation. At the estate, he was met by Gennard Lapan, a 43-year-old Lonian feudal lord who was sociable and merciful. The first thing he asked was how the prince was feeling after the journey. The prince was not feeling very well. It was uncomfortable in the carriage. Gennard Lapan asked who had arrived with the prince, and considering that he was in exile, they treated him quite well. The prince asked them to stop talking and take him to his room. The place where the prince had arrived was also called the Sacrificial Fortress. It was located on the very land of the dead spirits of Lonia. This place was so named because of the sacrifices made by those who wanted to appease the wrath of the dead, for only the walls erected around the castle could save it from the wave of destruction. They would be able to protect it from the zombies for a month until spring, after the wave of destruction. All prisoners were to be sent to the front line. The prince only needed help with the wounded and conducting funerals. Every year, there were at least 2,000 or 3,000 deaths here. There were about 80 priests in the castle, who could help with the purification ritual. The soldiers were supposed to help the prince with the funerals, but sometimes people died from overwork, and that was just the way it was. The prince called over Jenard Lepan, who was passing by. He told him that he wanted to relax a little and have a drink. In such circumstances, it was simply impossible to survive without alcohol, and the prince would rather die from drinking than from hard work. He told Charlotte to have fun with Grillo, but they had to return to the fortress before the wave of death began. After all, they still had to think about protecting the prince himself. Meanwhile, he went to rest and slammed the door behind him. Charlotte shouted after him to trust them, and the knights were surprised at how quickly the prince had grown up. The prince played this little scene out perfectly in front of everyone. Of course, he had no intention of drinking anything here. He began to consecrate the liquid in these bottles. It shone with a divine light and began to change color, turning into holy water. After all, without holy water, the prince would not be able to cope here. He decided to fill the vessel with holy water and drink it to invigorate himself. And if he continued to transfer energy to water, he would learn to control his power better. But he put the bottles aside because he was very attracted to one object on the wall. It was a rifle hanging on the wall in a frame on red velvet. He had read that there were weapons in this world, but he did not think they were so widespread. In this world, almost no one uses such weapons, and people prefer melee weapons because this world is teeming with monsters. Weapons like the one on this wall were only used for entertainment. The thing is, instead of gunpowder, such a rifle needs mana. It could be loaded with mana or holy water, but then the mana consumption would be too high. So even experienced mages could only fire 5 shots. After all, it takes 5 minutes to create a bullet with mana, so it's no surprise that no one uses it. In movies, zombies were destroyed with a single shot, but in reality, this was not the case. First, you definitely had to create the bullet itself. Then, of course, you had to aim carefully at the zombie, and only after all that could you fire at your target. The prince was also able to successfully create a bullet using holy water. He also activated a new divine energy skill, but the noise from the shot attracted a lot of attention. The soldiers noticed that the deputy seemed to be in a bad mood, but thought that he was worried about the approaching wave of destruction. But then they realized that it was all because of the 7th prince. The deputy sent them to watch over the prisoners instead of gossiping. The soldiers immediately went to carry out the deputy's order. But in a way they were right, because his mood was indeed due to the 7th prince. Yesterday he also heard this loud, incomprehensible noise coming from the fortress. But the prince did not allow any of them to enter his room. However, the knight was completely sure that the prince had broken something. He seemed out of his mind and was behaving abnormally. The village elder said that the prince had changed a lot after his attempt to take his own life. The villagers told the knights that the prince had done everything necessary at the cemetery and had even fought against a group of zombies, thereby saving them. But the deputy commander of the knights decided that the villagers were talking nonsense and that the prince had most likely blackmailed. Perhaps he threatened them with physical violence so that they would repeat the prepared speech to the knights. But it was unclear how the prince managed to defeat such a powerful necromancer as Morgana. This meant that the guy named Grill was very strong, and the situation became even more confusing. The knight decided to write a letter of recommendation so that Grill could take the exam for the title of Holy Knight. But suddenly he heard a noise around the corner and decided that the prisoners had rebelled again. He ran out from around the corner shouting that they had caused trouble before the big battle. But he was stunned by what he saw and couldn't react quickly. The prince held his shovel to the throat of one of the men standing there. He was very surprised that the man did not know who he really was. The day after arriving at the Lonia mansion, people began to die from disease and exhaustion. It was not surprising why everyone cared so much about the prince. They just wanted to make him work. The bird's beak mask protected him because it had a cleansing spell cast on it to prevent infection. It seemed that time was not pressing yet and the zombies were not even approaching. Suddenly, someone called out to the prince from behind and suggested taking a break. In front of him was Hayes Hedron, the eldest son of Count Hedron. He decided that the prince, like himself, was a student at one of the academies. He thought that he was here because of disciplinary punishment. Children from noble families could easily get exemption, but they thought that the prince was just a country bumpkin from the outskirts. If he wanted to live peacefully and quietly, it was better for him to listen to Sir Hayes. After all, he had come all this way to find a servant he liked. His gaze fell on Charlotte, and he decided that she would suit him. Hayes asked the prince if this girl was his servant. Hayes had his eye on her because she was very pretty. He offered to take care of her, but she ran away in fear and then forced him to raise his hand. These guys were of no interest to the prince, and he preferred to go dig graves rather than hang out with. Suddenly, the prince heard Hayes call Charlotte a servant behind his back. He ordered Charlotte to come closer to him. When she approached him, he grabbed Charlotte's hand with all his strength. He suggested that she have fun with them instead of with her busy master. Charlotte replied that she was not in the mood for that, but Hayes responded that no one was going to have fun with a commoner like her. In response to these words, Charlotte squeezed Hayes's hand with all her strength. Hayes screamed in pain, and the prince thought that Charlotte might break his hand. Hayes screamed in pain, saying that people like her had nothing to show but strength. But the prince couldn't take it anymore and interrupted him, telling him to stop insulting Charlotte. But Hayes did not relent, continuing to shout that Charlotte's parents must have been monsters because she looked so much like them. And considering that half of the people who had died in the country had become zombies, the same fate awaited her mother and father. At that moment, the prince's shovel was already hanging over Hayes's head and flew past his face, missing him by literally a centimeter. It hit the ground with full force, scattering small stones right at his feet. In response to Hayes's indignation, the prince said that he had made a slight mistake while digging the grave, and when the blow landed squarely on Hayes's face, the prince joked that his hand had slipped. The blow sent Hayes flying far away and crashing to the ground. He began to shout, asking if this guy even knew who he was. In response, the prince asked if he knew who was standing before him. Their fight was stopped by a knight who ran up to the commotion. He stopped the prince and asked if he really wanted to cause trouble again. Hayes assured the holy knight that he had been struck and asked him to punish his offender. But since Hayes was the eldest son of Count Hedron, the knight could not let it go. Suddenly, a sticky silence enveloped everyone present. The holy knight could not utter a word, but he could hear the prince. It was a powerful spell using holy power. Turning mentally to Harmon, the prince asked him to tell this scoundrel who he really was. Hearing this, the holy knight could not act otherwise. He announced that before them stood Alan Elfoles, the seventh prince and grandson of the Holy Emperor. Now the prince asked Hayes if he understood whose servant he had been so rude to and to whom he had shown disrespect. Hayes was in complete shock and did not know what to say in response. The prince told him that if he sincerely apologized, there would be no problem. But after this situation, the prince had some problems and ended up behind bars. According to the Holy Knight, the injury inflicted on the nobleman's son could not be forgiven. After all, he lost consciousness from his injuries and was carried away on a stretcher. Charlotte was very upset that because of her, the prince would have to spend a whole week in such conditions. The prince was not particularly upset and decided to pass the time reading. Meanwhile, a strong blizzard arose outside the walls of the fortress. The prisoners were ordered to clear the snow, but the blizzard was so strong that they could not keep up. The Holy Knight couldn't get it out of his head that the prince had used a spell because the blood of the Holy Emperor flowed in his veins. And he couldn't get this strange situation out of his head. Distracting himself a little from his thoughts, he ordered the soldiers to continue clearing the snow to maintain the height of the fortress walls. Although the frost had already set in, there weren't that many zombies. The Holy Emperor had destroyed the King of the Dead Spirits on December 25th. It was necessary to report everything to the Holy Emperor's family, so the knight ordered the prisoners to be gathered. But it took time to gather them, and the alarm bell rang. The gates of the fortress opened, and everyone began to go back inside. But suddenly, fresh zombie tracks appeared on the white, loose snow. The zombies attacked the prisoners who had not managed to hide behind the walls of the fortress. They needed to close the castle gates as soon as possible. Those who had been bitten by zombies urgently needed the help of priests. The zombies attacked them from behind, and they couldn't spot them because of the heavy snowstorm. All those who were behind these poor souls were already being eaten by zombies. Everyone urgently needed to take up their positions and prepare for battle. The day of the death of Aemon, King of the Dead Spirits, was approaching, and the zombies simply could not fail to appear. Soon there would be at least 3,000 dead here. How did this happen? No one could have imagined that the zombies would attack from behind. Perhaps they suppressed their instincts by hiding under the snowdrifts. But the undead are lifeless people, and they fear nothing and rely only on their instincts. And since they did not wear equipment and did not use any strategies, it was easy to deal with them every year. However, this time everything looked completely different and something went wrong. The zombies were aware of their actions and marched in formation like soldiers. They beat their drums in unison, setting the pace for the entire formation. It was a perfectly trained army of the dead. There was something unusual about it all, because nothing like this had ever happened before. Their appearance instilled genuine fear in the people in the fortress. They chanted loudly, telling the people to await their inevitable doom. The fear of these people watching what was happening was very justified. Along with the army of the undead was the judge of this world, who proclaimed himself the mission that would save this world through destruction. He was none other than a follower of Udai, the god of destruction. The vampire count, whose bite deprived people of mana, was also an arrogant necromancer. The prince did not know what was happening outside, but he could hear the noise coming from there, and for some reason no one had brought him food to his cell today. The prince wanted to call out to someone, because it was wrong to leave him hungry. But then Lepan ran up and shouted for the prince to come out quickly. The prince was surprised because he was still under guard, but Jenard explained that this was not the most important thing right now, because there was a whole squad of dead people on the street. The prince thought that they wanted to release him simply because they needed workers. But that was not the case. There really was a whole horde outside. This time, the vampire count had brought an entire regiment of zombies with him. Lepan claimed that this vampire spoke their language and controlled other monsters. He himself did not know exactly what had happened, because now the Holy Knight Harmon was fighting them off. The fortress could fall, so the prince needed to evacuate to a safer place. And Lepan had to escort the 7th prince there. Suddenly, there was a noise upstairs. Most likely, it was a group of zombies, and they needed to quickly exit through the back door. But suddenly, growling zombies began to fall from the ceiling. They fell into the chamber where the prince was, along with pieces of the ceiling. The prince was very frightened by the surprise and screamed. After all, the cell where he had been just a few seconds ago was now filled with zombies, and this pile of dead bodies was ready to attack at any moment. They realized that the huge vampire count had thrown a crowd of zombies at them, and now the dead had invaded the fortress. And since they were already being attacked here, the prince was afraid to imagine what was happening outside. After managing to close the cell door, the prince shouted to Lepan to quickly pull himself together and go command the soldiers. After all, the more people died, the more zombies there would be, and he ran to find shelter for the inhabitants. For now, the prince did not know what to do next, because he had managed before because the monsters were not very high level. But now there were too many of these undead creatures. In such a situation, his only option was to flee. To achieve this goal, the 7th prince used holy power. With its help, he was able to stop the zombies that were in the chamber. While the zombies lay motionless, he had to do something urgently. He had to seize the moment and get out onto the street as quickly as possible. The prince did just that, passing through a hole in the wall and finding himself on the street in a heavy snowstorm. But outside, the terrifying growls of the undead could be heard from all around. Unable to cope with their onslaught, people screamed and called for help. The zombies attacked them from all sides, leaving them no chance of escape. There was nowhere left for these unfortunate people to run to in the hope of salvation. The soldiers ordered those who could still escape to run, while they held back the crowd of the dead with their shields. But behind them too was a huge pack of growling, hungry zombies. The prince did not know how long he could hold out in such a situation thanks to the holy water. He gripped the handle of his shovel tightly because everything was not going as he had thought. He had a feeling that the goddess Gaia was angry that she could not control them. The 7th prince tried his best and spread his blessing, and it spread everywhere around him, along with the water. What was happening to them was a real exhausting epidemic. But suddenly it rained again, and this rain was holy water. The drops of this holy rain fell on the zombies and burned them. The undead could no longer fight, and the people had a chance. The zombies melted in the rain, while the people's wounds healed. What was happening around them now was nothing short of a miracle. The people rejoiced because holy water was indeed falling from the sky. They thought that this must be a blessing from Gaia. But then they realized that it was all the work of the 7th prince. Looking in his direction, they saw that holy water surrounded his highness. But the prince was already very exhausted because he had lost a lot of strength. Although he was an exiled prince, the people saw how he used the holy water. He was also the grandson of the hero who had stopped Amon, the king of the dead spirits 50 years ago, and the blood of the holy emperor Alphonse flowed in the 7th prince. Then the knights asked which of the residents needed help. The lord had opened the basement of the mansion, and now everyone could take shelter there. The people were happy to be alive and finally able to escape. All this was thanks to the prince, but he had only summoned rain inside the fortress and was already very tired. The soldiers also did well in this difficult situation. The 7th prince called on them to go with him and help the holy knight. It was impossible to get rid of the undead with such ordinary weapons, so the prince gave the knights his blessing. He was doing this for the first time, so he did not know how long it would last, but now their weapons had a holy buff. Now their weapons were not so useless, but they still had to pay him for saving their lives. And the prince called them all to follow him because they would have to fight for their lives. They went outside the fortress to help in the battle against the crowd of zombies, and they became remarkably good at destroying them. The soldiers barely touched the zombies with their weapons, and they were already dying. Now their swords truly had holy power. This greatly encouraged the soldiers to continue the battle. Now they understood that they had a chance of victory. They were confident that they could deal with these undead creatures because they had the hero's descendant with them. But suddenly they saw a huge Dullahan approaching them. It was a truly terrifying sight that frightened the soldiers greatly. After all, they had never had to fight such an enemy before. The soldiers realized that they could not defeat such a monster on their own. And now a rifle that the prince had seen on the castle wall came to their aid. The seventh prince decided to fire at the monster from a distance. Apologizing to the soldiers, he took his shot at the target. It was only the second shot the prince had ever fired, so he wasn't very skilled at it. The vampire count sensed the energy of life, for there were pieces of fresh meat that he had not tasted in 50 years. He was curious to see how juicy they were, and if he turned them into zombies, his regiment would become even more powerful. He had been waiting for this opportunity for 50 years, having gone from a soulless zombie living by instinct to a ghoul, and from a terrifying ghoul to a terrifying Dullahan, and then to a lord. And now he had moved on to the next stage and become a vampire. This was the path he had taken before he gained the ability to think. All existing vampires were divided according to the mana they possessed. He had become a vampire not so long ago, so the others had not yet recognized him, but he was confident in himself because he was a count. And it was in the hands of the vampire count that the skull of King Amon was held. Thanks to it, he was able to gather in a couple of decades the amount of mana that would have taken him at least 100 years to gather without it. He was able to command an army of 20,000 zombies, and was soon going to surpass the count's level and become king. Ordinary holy water no longer frightened undead of this level. Approaching the fortress, he shouted to the knights to surrender and become the dead. The soldiers at the fortress were not to stop shooting. They had to hold on and not let the undead break through, because when the sun went down, they became stronger, and they had to destroy at least one more, because if they lost, it would be the end of the village. It was impossible to transfer command of this position to someone else because the army was too close. If something happened to the village, it was unclear what would happen next, and at times like this, they really wished the Holy Emperor was there. Suddenly, the Holy Knight heard someone approaching behind him. It was Charlotte, and she was sure that the village was safe. She was holding a pile of spears and arrows and said that their prince was with them, and she would selflessly defend the place where His Highness was. The Holy Knight was very surprised by the words of young Charlotte, but he agreed with her decision because he thought she was just a servant. Charlotte had heard that the seventh prince wanted the weapons to be carried up to the fortress walls. But even experienced soldiers could not carry so many weapons, and the knight could not understand where she got such strength. Even a child like Charlotte tried, but the Holy Knight himself was not weak. They were all very determined to deal with the approaching enemy. But if necessary, the prince was ready to break through himself and cut off the vampire's head. Meanwhile, the enemy was preparing a new batch of zombie shells. Hearing the screams and commotion outside, Charlotte and the knight tensed up. At that moment, a whole crowd of dead people flew into the castle. The Holy Knight understood that this was very dangerous and ordered Charlotte to stand behind him. He prayed to the god of battle, Heine, and asked him to grant him strength. But then Charlotte grabbed her sword and rushed forward ahead of the knight. She aimed her sword, filled with incredible power, directly at the zombies. The remains of the dead, torn into several pieces, flew in all directions. The Holy Knight was shocked by what he saw and could not understand how such a fragile girl could do such a thing. After all, he saw with his own eyes how she cut the zombie in half, and the evil creature slain by this girl could not even get up. The prince knew that the undead could only be stopped by aiming at the head or using a weapon with holy water, and now he was very interested in one important question. He wanted to understand what kind of sword Charlotte had used in battle. After all, with its help, she destroyed her enemies without giving them a chance. Although her sword technique was sloppy and far from perfect, she used muscle power to compensate for her poor sword skills. This destructive power and rough strikes were definitely related to the imperial art of swordplay passed down to the Holy Cross Corps. The Holy Knight watched Charlotte from the top of the fortress, and when she finished, he called out to her. He asked her where she had learned this, and whether she was related to the Holy Imperial family. Standing among a pile of defeated zombies, she replied that she was just an assistant to the seventh prince. She had taught herself this sword technique from a book, but the seventh prince was standing too high and too far away from her. He couldn't really hear what Charlotte replied to Harmon. When the priests ran out of holy water to heal the wounded, they had to use the water they had brought in a huge box. The seventh prince had given them these vessels, saying that he had brought holy water with him just in case. They were very lucky that he did so, and Jenard Lapin asked where the prince himself was now. One of the soldiers replied that Having returned from the battlefield, he had taken the remaining soldiers and gone to help on the wall. Everyone thought that Jenard Lapan had given him permission to go back into battle. Everyone praised the prince and his holy power, and it wasn't that Jenard didn't trust him. He was just worried that no one would be left inside the castle walls. After all, shields and spears were scattered everywhere, and everything was covered in blood. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a new group of soldiers came to their aid. But these were no ordinary people. They were zombies dressed in military uniforms. It was the 7th prince who brought them to the fortress wall to help. Putting on his mask, he explained that some of the soldiers had been sent to the walls. The soldiers were surprised that anyone was still alive, as the situation at the main gate was dire. The prince hoped that due to the commotion, no one would look closely at the faces of these soldiers. The prince distributed all the holy water, so he didn't have enough for himself and couldn't activate his new skill, Ghost Soldiers. He needed to raise old soldiers, but that was too difficult, so the prince simply used the dead bodies from the village. If they were caught, it would be the end, so the prince decided to cut open their faces. Seeing the prince, one of the soldiers said that it would be better for him to stay behind, but the prince said that he had a couple of things to do on the way. He wanted to try using his rifle again. The soldier tried to convince him that the rifle was useless here, but the prince pointed out that the view was indeed better from here. And from this height, the vampire count was also very clearly visible. The 7th prince aimed his rifle at the head of the main boss. Then he lowered his sights and aimed between his legs. It was time to give the vampire count a taste of Gaia's blessing. At that moment, one of the holy knights ran up to the deputy. He said he had heard that the evacuation was complete. He asked for permission to help here. Fortunately, the situation in this place did not get any worse. The soldiers had somehow obtained weapons loaded with holy water. Some of the fighters were as skilled as the holy knights, and more fighters arrived just in time to help. In general, the situation had not worsened, but they did not know what to do with the vampire. They had already used arrows and stones for long-range combat, but all their projectiles were blocked by his magic shield, and even if they loaded their guns with holy water, they still couldn't pierce the shield created by the vampire. It turned out that they would have to break through hordes of zombies to get to the vampire, but they couldn't even fight back properly, so it was impossible. But suddenly they saw something unusual happening, something that ordinary priests were not capable of. Everything around them was illuminated by a bright light, and the prince turned to Gaia, the goddess of love and mercy. He asked her to send holy salvation and allow him to use the power that strikes the dead. This was necessary for him to break through the vampire's shield. And at that moment, the goddess Gaia heard the 7th prince's plea. Small particles of light in the pitch darkness reflected the face of God. This was the blessing sent down to them from above by the goddess Gaia. But even the most experienced priests rarely encountered such a thing, and no one could have imagined that there were such powerful priests in Lonia. And then someone suddenly said that the 7th prince was standing above. It was young Charlotte, and she recognized the light of the 7th prince. The holy knight Harmon looked at the girl with disbelief. After all, it was strange that the prince who had opposed the goddess had received her blessing. If this was true, then the 7th prince was inheriting the goddess's love. Now it was time for the prince to taste Gaia's blessing. The 7th prince pulled the trigger and fired a bullet at the vampire. The bullet flew down the road, striking ordinary zombies with its power. On its way to its target, it encountered the vampire's protective shield, but thanks to its holy power, it was able to pierce through the shield. It struck the vampire count right between the legs, hitting its target precisely. The main boss of all the undead cried out in pain from the force of the blow. The method of gathering holy power was described in detail in the Book of the Holy Emperor, and this book describes something else very remarkable. If all magicians used spells and mana for their purposes, then priests, on the contrary, were aided by prayers and holy water. Necromancers, on the other hand, could use life and magical power. In essence, the prince would have to give up his life and magical power. But was it worth it? He had enough holy water simply because he was the grandson of the Holy Emperor. If he could use his powers without sacrificing his life, then he could give the role of priest a chance. After thinking it over, he decided to try. At that moment, the vampire count was screaming at the top of his lungs in pain and frustration. He demanded that reinforcements arrive immediately. Because of this, the 7th prince had to work hard, but he succeeded. The zombie squad began to retreat, and it was time to help the wounded. The vampire himself did not die, of course, but they gained some time to prepare. Then the 7th prince noticed the soldiers below looking at him with bewilderment. Alan commanded that it was time to help the wounded soldiers. The soldiers saw the blessing of the goddess for the first time, and perhaps there was some experienced priest before them, which meant that the wounded could be healed quickly. The holy knight still couldn't believe that it was all the work of the 7th prince. After all, he was considered a good-for-nothing boy who deserved to be exiled. Had he really changed so much that he was capable of such a feat? The knight was also interested in how a girl with such skills could become the prince's assistant. While Harmon was pondering this, the seventh prince was already rushing to help the wounded. And even though everyone around him insisted that the prince had changed, the holy knight did not believe it. Could he really have become a completely different person after losing his memory? Or had he forgotten what had happened on that day in the past and become his former self again? The Holy Knight meant who he was before the death of Her Majesty Elisha. The late Elisha was the mother of the first and seventh princes. She was a village girl, a representative of the Holy Nation and Southern Aslan, and these races had been hostile to each other for hundreds of years. Because of this, many members of high society simply did not accept her. However, the son of the Holy Emperor fell in love with her with all his heart, and they married, and thus the first prince was born. The imperial family had too much influence, and two ladies of noble blood were presented to the son of the Holy Emperor. After this acquaintance, several more children were born. Despite everything, Elisha gave birth to the seventh prince. Everything seemed to be going well. The boy grew up and his mother loved him very much. But when the boy turned 10, Elisha died suddenly. On that day, she was attacked by a vampire during a night walk with her sons. Elisha tried to protect the seventh prince but was torn to pieces. The first prince, who barely survived that day, began to suffer from a curse. After this incident, the kind-hearted seventh prince became insensitive. They say he was so shocked by what he saw that he went mad. Could a man who lost his memory after attempting to take his own life ever be the same again? Although memory loss could have nothing to do with holy power, and it didn't matter whether the prince lost his memory or not, the question was why he kept his holy power a secret in the first place. Thinking about this, the Holy Knight thought that perhaps he did not want to attract the attention of the imperial family, and perhaps the prince was planning revenge, and the imperial palace was not kind to princes and princesses. The princes had a hard time because high society never missed an opportunity to make a snide remark, and perhaps the seventh prince wanted to take revenge on the nobility and the vampire for the death of his mother. It was quite possible that he planned his exile in order to become stronger away from constant surveillance. The knights had a direct connection to the imperial family, so Harmon understood why the prince behaved that way around him. As for Charlotte, it was quite impossible that she was from a good family. In the memories of the Holy Knight, Elisha had always been kind and sweet, and when the first prince ordered him to call for help that night, perhaps he should not have left, and he regretted it to this day. No matter how hard he tried, he could not forget the shame of not being able to protect them. All these thoughts brought the knight back to the idea that the seventh prince was planning revenge, and for this he was willing to endure insults and cruelty. If the seventh prince wanted to avenge his mother's death, the Holy Knight would help him for a long time. But to carry out these plans, they first needed to deal with Lonya. Seeing the soldier walking, the Holy Knight asked if he was patrolling the area, but the soldier did not answer, and the knight thought that he had not heard him because of the wind. It was strange that the soldier was walking at night without a lantern, and this led the knight to wonder if he was human at all. The Holy Knight Harmon rushed towards this strange soldier. Their two sharp blades clashed in a fierce duel, but then the mask on the soldier's face slipped slightly, and the knight saw that he was facing a zombie. And there was definitely more than one of these extremely unusual soldiers here. But these zombies did not only radiate demonic energy. It was very strange that they also radiated holy power. But be that as it may, the Holy Knight could not just leave it at that. Harmon had to destroy this evil as soon as possible, and the Holy Knight already raised his blade above the zombie's head. But suddenly, someone nearby shouted the word "stop." Hearing this command, the zombie immediately stopped moving. It was the seventh prince, and the Holy Knight asked him what was going on. The seventh prince asked Knight Harmon to lower his sword. The two of them walked through the fortress, and the prince asked the knight if he had finished rearranging the troops. But before answering all his questions, Harmon decided to ask the prince something. He wanted to know if the prince used necromancy. But the prince remained silent, and an awkward pause ensued. Alan just joked that he didn't know himself, but the thought that he had been caught and that this was the end was spinning in his head. But the knight was sure that this was not something to be talked about so carelessly. Had the prince begun to study necromancy? But he didn't know how to answer. The prince asked how the knight knew that he had summoned the undead, because due to his memory loss, he didn't know where he had gotten such abilities and had done it to help in battle. The seventh prince understood that the bright knight would not believe him if he said that he had been reincarnated. Harmon continued to ask where the zombie got his holy power, but the prince insisted that he was not hiding anything and had always been interested in necromancy. The prince asked if Harmon would tell the inquisitors about all this. The Holy Knight had no choice but to report it. The prince was terrified because he understood that now he was definitely doomed. He knew that now he would be caught and tortured, but perhaps Charlotte would save him. But suddenly something happened that the seventh prince certainly did not expect. Harmon knelt before him and said that he would not report to the inquisitors. These words and actions of the Holy Knight greatly surprised the seventh prince. Harmon also said that he would help him until the very end. All this time, the prince was sure that this knight hated him, but it turned out that he wanted to help him. But perhaps he finally decided to pull the right strings. The prince became very worried because he was a completely rotten thread. He couldn't trust Harmon and decided that he just wanted to watch him. The Holy Knight denied this and wanted to tell him something from the time when the prince was a child. But the prince interrupted him and said that first they had to do what they had to do. After all, now was the most opportune time for them to act. The enemy would not waste precious time filled with mana. He congratulated Harmon on Christmas and Halloween at the same time. The vampire count loudly commanded all the dead that their time had come. He urged them to start eating the living and multiplying as soon as possible. He promised all these hungry undead that they would become kings. Incredible power erupted from the mouth of the chief vampire. Seeing this, everyone in the fortress was told to hold their positions. Turning to Sir Gennard, one of the boys said, trembling, that he didn't think he could do it because his jaw, where the prince had struck him, still hurt. For a second, Gennard wondered if he was making the right decision. But with every step, the army of the undead was getting closer to the fortress. The thought of retreating flashed through his mind, but then one of the masked priests appeared behind him. Gennard hoped very much that this priest would be able to save them. The prince turned again to the goddess Gaia and asked her to bless all those who would fight. Thus, the seventh prince activated the skill of weakening the epidemic. It was supposed to help the soldiers deal with the undead. Gennard was very happy that such a powerful priest was with them. He was also happy that the goddess Gaia was with them in this difficult battle. The soldiers, inspired, rushed into battle to destroy the zombies. The Holy Knight turned to the god of battle, Heim, and asked him to lend him his strength. Now the prince had every chance to raise the morale of the soldiers. The Holy Knight also could not miss such a wonderful opportunity. After all, his only important goal was the huge vampire count. The boss of all the undead did not think that the priest would completely block his path, and the area affected by his divine power was not restored. Because of this, the vampire count could no longer contain his terrible anger. The Holy Prince saw that something was wrong, and in the next moment, the vampire count appeared behind the prince. Everyone shouted that the vampire was very close and heading towards the priest. Frightened by what they saw, all the soldiers seemed to freeze. The Lord approached them and shouted loudly, asking if they were going to stop him. After all these people were like tiny insects to him. The prince understood that the vampire would try to provoke him first. Just as the prince could see the flow of mana, the vampire could see his sacred power, and it was only a matter of time before he found him. In principle, he needed to move to a better location, as planned, using the dense wall of the territory. This was necessary to prevent this creature from reaching the prince. But then the seventh prince saw his enemy very close by. The Lord laughed. Did he really think he could stop him with such insects? He was already preparing to destroy the prince. But the seventh prince had anticipated that this might happen. He decided it was time to use the plan he had prepared in advance. The prince shouted loudly to Charlotte to start acting. Charlotte held a huge piece of stone wall in her hands and used it as a shield. But the vampire's magic was too strong and the wall might not hold. Charlotte still didn't know how to control her power properly, and in this situation they could both melt from his magic. Suddenly Charlotte saw that unexpected help had arrived. It was Grill, even though he had no idea how to fight with swords. But he still wanted to help his daughter in any way he could. For Charlotte, such support from her stepfather was very valuable, and hand in hand they began to hold back the onslaught of the huge vampire. But it turned out to be very difficult, and Grill's strength was almost exhausted. Suddenly, at that very moment, the seventh prince appeared behind them. He still could not properly control his sacred power, but perhaps this wall could also be strengthened with divine energy. He called upon the goddess Gaia and asked her to give him the strength to protect these unfortunate people. He asked her to give them her protection, to stop the undead, as well as to grant them love and forgiveness. He asked her to respond and help them in answer to all his prayers. The goddess Gaia heard the seventh prince's pleas this time too. And the seventh prince was illuminated by the divine power of the goddess Gaia. And at that very moment, pieces of stone walls flew from everywhere. In all this dust and chaos, Charlotte tried to find her uncle and the prince. Suddenly, she saw one of the people she was looking for nearby. It was Grill, lying motionless amid the clouds of dust and smoke. Charlotte was very frightened for him, but the prince stopped her, saying that her uncle was fine and just unconscious. He asked Charlotte to stay calm and not panic. She asked how the prince was feeling, and he replied that he was very tired, as if he were about to pass away, but otherwise everything was fine. Meanwhile, the holy power was destroying the body of the huge Dullahan. In his condition, the prince could no longer fight, and he had run out of holy water. But for them, it was a chance to escape. He told Charlotte to carry Grill so that they could all hide underground. But then the prince realized that the holy power was running out faster than he thought. And while they were running, the prince noticed something quite strange. For some reason, the mana was gathering not near the vampire, but somewhere else. That place was the skull hanging around the vampire count's neck, and the prince had to go back to check something. He needed to understand what functions this skull performed. It was the skull of the king of necromancers, and the magical power of its user increased by 200%. The Lord understood that the holy power was destroying him, and he needed to recover as soon as possible.